Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. Well, maybe not see you because I can't see you and you can't see me, but nice to be with you. Today we're going to be talking about who's cooking. And one of the first things that came to mind about who's cooking is the story behind cake mixes and why there's an egg in them. So, a lot of packaged baked goods like pancake mix and biscuits, you can just add water. You've probably done this at home. And when cake mixes were first introduced at grocery stores in the 40s, this was true of them too. But during the 50s, sales of packaged cake mix really started dropping, and manufacturers were concerned about the reasons why. One of these reasons turned out to be that when cakes are baked for special occasions, they're more than just flour or sugar, they're a labor of love. They're very symbolic. And if you're just adding water and mixing it together with this powder, where's the labor? Where's the love? And a lot of consumers at the time reported that they felt like they should be putting more effort in when making a cake for someone. This was additionally complicated because in the 50s, egg additives in cake mixes were not that great. So the texture was not as moist as you see labeled here. And they tasted a little eggy and they just didn't make that great cakes. So the texture and the height was a little funky. They didn't taste right. A real fresh egg added instead of the egg additives in the mix made a much better cake. And you can see this is still how cakes are marketed today. So the picture in the middle, the super moist cake mix, is advertised first by flavor, which is actually a color, yellow, but really it's advertised by texture. So cake mix sales started picking up again once the egg additives were taken out and consumers were asked to add and mix in their own fresh egg. But there was another complicating factor to this, and when you look at all these cakes in the pictures, there's something besides just the cake mix. There's also frosting and toppings. And a lot of the labor of love of making cakes has moved from simply making the cake to decorating it and frosting it. Now, I don't have any data to back this up, but I was shopping for cake mix at the store recently, and it seems that the cake mix selection has shrunk in recent years, but the decoration section has expanded. And I don't know if this is due to shows like the Great British Baking Show, where they routinely emphasize decoration alongside flavor of the cake, and often the decorating is a lot more labor intensive. Children's birthday parties often include elaborately decorated bought cakes now instead of something homemade, as potentially a new way to show that you've labored to make the money to buy the cake, and by providing the elaborate cake, you are signaling your love. Cake mix are still relatively popular, and one of the reasons that cake mix sales have remained high is that people also don't really have the time or the skills to make cakes from scratch anymore, starting with cake flour and whisking egg whites and all that. Although a lot of television shows have reintroduced cake making, but cake mixes like the ones shown are simple enough that you don't really need a lot of complex equipment or even prior knowledge to make one. So the cake you see on the left is the one that I made with my daughter for her third birthday. I let her do the sprinkles, and it was simple enough for a 3-year-old to do almost entirely on her own. The ease of making cakes is something that wasn't really possible until the last century. Prior to the invention of baking powder, all cakes had to be mixed with beaten egg whites so that they could rise. I have some cake recipes going back to the 1600s in the US, and they all use this method of whisking egg whites together until they get foamy and then folding that in to the other ingredients, and the foamy egg whites support the structure of the cake. The really difficult thing about making these cakes is that before the 1830s, whisks weren't invented yet, and egg beaters weren't invented until the early 1920s. So people are whisking egg whites using forks or split twigs, often on a flat plate to get the egg whites whisked high enough to rise a cake. Now that is labor. So this is a picture of traditional whisk making in Sweden in the 1920s. You see how they're bundling the sticks together, and they can use that bundle of sticks to whisk the egg whites. So cakes raised in this method, especially before the mid 1800s, were certainly for special occasions, and not just because of their expensive ingredients like butter and sugar, but in the difficulty and knowledge required for preparation. Also missing before the mid 1800s were things like temperature controlled ovens and oven thermometers and timers. So I challenge you to try cooking something in your oven without knowing how hot it is or how much time has passed. Now, some of you may be used to cooking over an open campfire, and you know how much intuition is involved in gauging the heat of the fire and the heat of the Dutch oven or the frying pan and the time that's passed before the food has done. And you certainly can produce wonderful foods in this method, but it does take a lot more knowledge and a lot more experience. I suspect from some of your discussion groups that several people in the class are very much in the process of learning how to cook, even with all of the tools that we have at our disposal. I was in the same situation in college. The convenience and availability of prepared foods mean that you might never have to learn how to cook. Although access to knowledge, access to equipment, and access to ingredients certainly affects whether you can learn to cook and what you can learn to cook. And in many cases in the US, lack of access to ingredients like fresh fruits and vegetables is correlated with a decline in cooking knowledge. So you may have heard of something called a food desert. A food desert is an area where people have limited access to affordable and nutritious foods. They occur both in urban and rural areas. In urban areas like Chicago, this is when there's a grocery store that's a mile or more away from your home, or it takes more than 20 or 30 minutes to get to the grocery store. There may be corner shops and small bodegas in your neighborhood, but oftentimes these shops don't carry a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, not a lot of quantity and not a lot of variety. There was a survey of corner shops in Los Angeles, and they were 95% likely to have a product that you may have heard of called Flaming Hot Cheetos, but only like 13% likely to have fresh broccoli. Now, when confronted with the two options, a lot of children in particular will choose the Flaming Hot Cheetos. But once there's a loss of access to ingredients, either by distance or price, there's a loss of exposure. There's a loss of exposure to the knowledge that something like broccoli is food. There's a loss of exposure of how to buy, store, and cook it. And there's loss of exposure to eating from scratch. The USDA estimates that in 2010, 23.5 million people in the US lived in a food desert where they didn't have easy access to fresh fruits and vegetables on a daily or weekly basis. Think of what you might do if you were confronted with a new ingredient like lotus root or celeriac or trout if you've never cooked fish before. How would you prepare these things? How would you take off the bad parts and leave the good parts and cut them into right sizes and put them over the right type of heat in the right kind of pan? There's a lot of assumed knowledge that you take with you when you begin learning how to cook something. You have to measure a lot of things. You have to measure the ingredients, what ingredients and how much. You have to measure the heat and how much. You have to measure how long you're going to be cooking these things for. And this can be quite intimidating to learn. Luckily, we live in the age of the internet, so there's lots of tutorials online about how to cook things. So I find even this how to cook eggs chart a little vague. Do you put the eggs into boiling water, or do you put them in cold water and let them stand until the water comes to boiling? It's not clear how much water per egg, etc. And it doesn't say anything about the amount of heat in the pan or the size of the pot. The best way to learn to cook something is really just to practice until you have that knowledge in your eyes and in your nose and in your hands. So maybe you want to make some chicken tonight. And I find this rice chart actually quite helpful, but it just shows you cooking rice is fairly simple, but the vast amount of knowledge that you have to cook something simple like rice. What amazing primates humans are. Now, a lot of people say, oh, I'm bad at cooking. I just can't do it. And I prefer to think you're just less experienced. Of course, everyone varies in the talents that we have, but a lot of times why people think they're bad at something is because there's been a lifetime of learning behind one skill or another that makes you good at it. So it really comes down to practice more than anything else. And like our other skills that are learned, cooking is very context dependent. Whether you learn to cook and spend time cooking can depend on who you are and your expectations of who cooks in the household and what people should be eating in the household. Should you be eating cooked food? Should you be eating prepared food? How much cooking do you expect to happen and by whom? These graphs are showing you the minutes per day that different types of people spend cooking. So for example, and it compares 2 years, 2003 and 2016. Now there have been some changes, but overall the trend remains the same. And it puts everyone into one of two categories. First, it divides the sample up into men versus women. And the top graph shows you men and women with different kinds of education. So for example, women with high school or some college, that's you, compared to men with high school or some college, that's you. In these categories, people who identify as women and with this amount of education will on average spend more time in their day cooking. But amount of education can vary here as well. So women with less than a high school degree on average cook more than women with some college. Of course, these are vast generalizations and very crudely measured categories, but the trends hold across the United States, even if they don't apply to you or your personal situation. Now, here's men with less than high school degrees, so a little less time cooking. The graph on the bottom is showing you the same thing, minutes per day of cooking for men versus women, and this time instead of education, they're showing you different categories of a very crudely measured ethnicity description. So it shows you that women who report their ethnicity as either Hispanic or non-Hispanic other will spend more time per day cooking than women who report themselves as non-Hispanic white or non-Hispanic black. So there might be some cultural differences in cooking patterns as well, as far as expectations of time per day cooking in the household. But these are very crudely measured categories, and I just want to remind you that ethnicity and race are social constructs, not biological constructs. And if you'd like to learn more, take either ANTH 102 or ANTH 104. Okay, so we've learned a little bit, we've talked a lot in here about who is cooking and some of the factors that might affect whether you're the one cooking or not. So we've discussed gender in different contexts like home cooking versus restaurant cooking, ethnicity and cultural expectations about how much cooking happens in the home. To some extent, age. As you age, you have more opportunities to learn things. And we've also talked about what is cooking. Is making mac and cheese cooking? Is microwaving a burrito cooking? Is making a cake mix by just adding water versus water and an egg? Is that cooking? There's a lot of gray area here, but one of the things we can use to tease apart these variables and how they affect cooking is the complexity of food. If you look at the labor of food preparation and access to different types of ingredients and methods, you can see how status and cooking are highly intertwined. Throughout history, the amount of ingredients and the complication of the dish created have been used to demonstrate status. Either because you have servants who could do things for you, like whisk egg whites with a stick on a plate, or you have a member of the family who's solely dedicated to fanciful food production. I tried to learn how to cook biryani while I was living in India. It's basically an Indian fried rice, and I shouldn't say basically, because by the time the 20th spice was added, I was totally at a loss for what was happening. The ancient Romans liked to host elaborate feasts with things like whole peacocks cooked and then reassembled with their feathers put back into them so they looked like they were still alive. If you ever host a dinner party today, probably the food that you're making is going to be a little more complicated and maybe a little more special than usual. Although there has been a small revolution in food culture lately with changing access to technology and bought foods, our cooking preferences might be returning more to the days of ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, most households had a very simple cooking ability in the house. They had a charcoal brazier where you could put hot coals and heat food. It could be moved from room to room, but mostly people bought prepared foods. And this was true of most early cities, and perhaps we are returning to this pattern again, where we have very simple food preparation in home and buy a lot of prepared foods. And now, um, meals with fewer ingredients of very high quality, prepared in simple manners, like at restaurants like Chez Panisse and the farm to table movement, have been used to signify high class, especially to younger generations. So the picture at the top here, this is something called a quenelle. It's basically a pureed fish puff with creamed fish or sometimes meat, combined with breadcrumbs and a light egg binding, formed into an egg like shape and then poached in a liquid. The only way to get it really, really fine and light and fluffy is to process it through a variety of sieves. And this used to be like the fancy thing to eat. Julia Child is all about the quenelles. People don't eat this kind of food anymore. We don't really care for the or it's not a status symbol to eat very highly processed foods. I think I told you I tried to offer Boise State students um, Vienna sausages one time, which is kind of like a quenelle. It's a highly processed meat product, and the students didn't want to eat it. They thought it was unpalatable and kind of yucky and too processed almost. With the invention of technology like the food processor and industrialization of the food industry, this has really eliminated the fad or the preferences for finely processed foods. But previously, the smoother the dish, the more servants you had, and the higher social status you had. And kitchens were often not very great places to work. They were not considered social spaces. And if you had to spend time in the kitchen personally, you were not a very high status person. But we can think about kitchens as these social spaces when you think that cooking is not just done anywhere. So kitchens are, for us now, specific rooms. Here's one of those charcoal braziers used by the ancient Greeks. This is a portable stand that you can put hot coals in and you can put a pot on top of. This little statue comes from around 4th century BCE. And if you think about where you're living, you can have a hot plate in your bedroom or mini fridge in your bathroom. Maybe you do have an Instant Pot in the laundry room, but probably not. Probably you've collected all of these kitchen cooking items, tools, and put them in a kitchen somewhere, a room dedicated for cooking and also often eating. Eating tends to be done in particular spaces. If you've ever eaten a meal in a hotel room, you can tell how strange it feels to be eating on the bed or on the floor or at a coffee table. Maybe think about the different types of food that you eat at different spaces in your own house. Is there food you eat at the counter or sitting at the table or on your coffee table or in bed? There's different kinds of foods and there's different kinds of meals for different spaces in the house. Even homes with only one room, like a lot of homes for households in the tropics, they'll have a specific cooking and eating area, oftentimes outdoors and adjacent to the home. But the kitchen, where people are cooking and eating, is still a central location and one where people tend to gather for a variety of activities besides cooking. Rooms dedicated to cooking, like kitchens, are also limiting cooking from the rest of the house for very real reasons, like the risk of fire. But sometimes there are other practical or ritualistic reasons for isolating kitchens. So if you do like to cook a lot of Indian cuisine and you live in an area where You can't open the windows all the time. A lot of people will build a second separate kitchen called a spice kitchen so they can keep the odors from all that flavored cooking from going into the rest of the house where they live. In some households where people keep kosher, sometimes they have specific kitchens to help them maintain kosher, if not two separate kitchens. So you'll have separate sinks for meat and for dairy. You'll have separate ovens for meat and for dairy, separate microwaves, separate dishwashers, two of everything, one for meat, one for dairy. Some appliances will go into Sabbath mode for you, where they disable electronics, or they have warming drawers and hot plates that help you heat food up, but not cook it. If you keep kosher, I've heard that the Shabbat water heater will make your water 105 degrees, which is not hot enough to cook anything, but warm enough to put your hands in. And interestingly, this two of everything in the kitchen model really does make cooking and cleanup a two-person job. So it explicitly turns cooking into a social activity. So the next time you see a picture of a kitchen like this, or you visit a kitchen, think about all the different spaces and what it's being used for, how it's being used. You know, this idea of the kitchen island existing is something that's really come into vogue this century. And how does it reflect our desire for casual socialization in the kitchen? I told you in a previous lecture that kitchens are now set up with the refrigerator at the center so people can easily access foods in and out of the refrigerator. What's the center of your kitchen? Is it the sink, the stove, the microwave? What do you use most? What tools do you keep out versus what tools are put away in cupboards? Do you gather with other people in your kitchen? Is it big enough for multiple people? Do you cook meals with other people, and how do you handle trading off tasks and organization? And how does the physical space of the kitchen as a room help you to do this? Now, there's a common phrase, to each their own. And preference and experience definitely play a role in how we structure the rooms we cook and eat in. We are still very much socially and emotionally tied to food and eating. There is no meal and a pill yet, or meal and a gum. Change, especially with cooking, often occurs more locally, like a new type of can opener, the invention of a better whisking tool, a silicone rubber spoon instead of a wooden one, minced garlic in a jar. All of these kitchens, as different as they look, are actually quite similar. They have a stove and an oven and a sink and some counter space, light, knives. They're actually quite set up for similar activities to be performed in them. So it's certainly true that anyone can cook. We might all do it in different ways with different ingredients and different amounts of knowledge. We might define cooking differently. The question of who's cooking might determine how different kitchens are set up. But ultimately, we all have to eat. Okay, that's it for today. Please take the plenary survey, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you next week.